Welcome to the Leading Movement Health Series. I'm your host, Phil Wagner, founder and CEO of Sparta Science. And here we host discussions with invited guests that have a vast experience at the intersection of both leadership and health. Often have the data and even the insights. So one of the things that's a challenge is how do we encourage leadership to allow success for organizations, particularly when it comes to health. And today's guest, we have retired Air Force General Mike Holmes. Mike was the former commander of the Air Combat Command, the ACC, but he came up as a fighter pilot and logged over 500 combat hours, call sign mobile. I was looking forward to saying that like I'm right out of Top Gun. You know, and the ACC, the Air Combat Command, is unique because it has over 100,000, almost 100,000 people, 1,300 aircrafts, 70 operating locations worldwide. But the thing that's most interesting is the ACC develops the strategy, the doctrine, the concepts, the tactics, the procedures for all the air and space employment. And leadership is so much about communicating standards clearly that I'm really excited to have General Holmes on the call. So thanks for joining us.
Hi, Phil. It's great to be here.
You know, Mike, why is health so important to the U.S. Air Force?
Well, I'd talk about Air Combat Command specifically, Phil. And, you know, we have kind of three different kinds of people. We have people that are kind of aerospace athletes, people that operate under real high movement stress that either do things like our special tactics weapons controllers or our pararescue men that have to maintain a high level of fitness and carry heavy loads. And then we have people that have to try to maintain their health when we force them to sit and do nothing, like people that are flying remotely piloted aircraft or the people that are watching the screens that are analyzing full motion video where we have them sit for 10 or 12 hour shifts in front of a screen with a lot of stress. And then we expect them to maintain their health. And then we have the vast majority of the people that are in between that work a job that's in between the stress and strain of being a special tactics controller or a 9G fighter pilot and the people that we have to sit all day that are the broad majority of people that have to try to find a balance in their life to stay healthy so they can keep doing this job for the long term. You know, we know that if you look at the percentage of people that are willing to consider joining the military these days, it's a small number. And then if you take that number and you look at the people that are physically qualified, either weight or no drug history or can pass the fitness standards to come in, you start with a very small recruiting pool to bring into the Air Force. And then once you have them, to keep them for the long term, to educate them, to train them, to make them really competent at what they do. If you aren't careful about the same time they really get full competence, they end up with some broken part of their health and they can't serve anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting to point out because when most people probably think of the Air Force, if you're not involved in the armed services, you're thinking everybody's a pilot, right? And everybody's flying planes. But one of the unique pieces of the Air Force is there is such a breadth of job responsibilities and therefore a breadth of fitness and backgrounds. And you really have to approach all those different subsets differently. And there has to be a common standard, yet at the same time, a different level expected from those groups, I imagine.
Right. So, you know, the Air Force has a universal fitness test that's frankly designed to measure mostly your cardiac fitness. It also has a little strength component to it, but it's designed to be easy to administer, easy to score, and it's probably not a good record of high-level fitness. And then some of the career fields within the Air Force have specific fitness tests that members have to maintain their proficiency to pass that generate requirements that are specific to that skill set and that career field.
Right. And so, you know, you mentioned recruiting, how do you see MEPS playing a role and how has it kind of evolved as you've seen, at least as relates to the Air Force?
Well, every service member that comes into the military has to make it through one of the MEPS. And I don't know, you may know what it stands for, medical evaluation, something probably. But, you know, when you go down, when your granddad went down to, you know, join the Army in World War II, he had to pass a set of tests to look into your overall health. And in Vietnam, you know, maybe when your dad was being evaluated to see what their draft status was, to see if they were physically fit enough to come in. And then today, everybody has to come through. And the people in MEPS have an important job. Their job is to make sure that we don't bring in people that are not going to be able to stick around. for a career or won't make it through their training. But over time, I think we got into a world where we were eliminating some people just because we could, because we had data to find what was wrong with them. And we probably went too far toward eliminating. You have the number one graduate of an ROTC program at someplace like MIT, and we won't let them come in because they have a little spot of eczema, on the back of their hand because we have standards that are set. Or if your medical records were maintained in the DoD system because you were a dependent growing up, and an example is I knew a young man that had a broken arm when he was in elementary school, and they wanted to go back and evaluate his records, and they're stored in a big warehouse in St. Louis somewhere, and you have to go ask for them and pull them, and they want to go back and look at it, where if that kid had not been a military dependent, they wouldn't have had any records to look at, and they would have made it through. So as we look at where we're going in the future, we're going to have to take a look at MEPS, and we're going to have to give them some new tools on how to really measure whether people can perform. And we need some new risk judgments too. It's not that we can't afford to have everybody only meet standards that we're sure they can last for a 40-year career, because the majority of people don't stay that long anyway. The majority of people stay one enlistment and then move back into civilian life.
Yeah, that's interesting is sometimes we don't really evaluate, organizations in general. What we're truly evaluating is a job requirement. And so in two cases I'm hearing you talk about, it's interesting. One is we can't evaluate fighter pilots the same way as we're evaluating remote pilots, right, with some of these standards, but also we can't be evaluating someone like everybody's going to have this 4-year career, because not everybody's going to have that, right? So there's got to be almost a data, upgrade, if you will, of some of these standards, not only for the job role, but also the expected duration of service.
Yeah, and we disqualify people because maybe they have an eye condition that 10% of the time is going to come back and cause some problems over their lifetime, and we say they can't serve, when in reality, they're much more likely to leave the service for some other reason.
Right.
And what we're doing, I think, is trying to guard pay and disability. And so, the lawyers are involved.
Right. Yeah. And so, what are some of the health challenges, I guess, within the Air Force you've seen just a drastic improvement of that were challenges initially?
I grew up in that, as you said, I grew up in the fighter flying world, flying the F-15 for a bunch of hours. And, flying the F-15 in the air-to-air role almost every day that you fly it, and I was flying it as a young person, I was flying 25 times a month. Almost every day you fly it, you're going to touch 8 to 9 times the force of gravity on your musculoskeletal system. And so you learn techniques on how to handle it, and you kind of teach yourself how to do it right. Over the time that I served, we got much smarter and better at, one, teaching people how to do a good anti-G straining maneuver, teaching people to use their legs and to tighten the muscles in their legs and to try to squeeze the blood up into their upper chest and up into their head so they can maintain their cognitive performance. And then the other thing we did was we learned a lot about how to build the muscle system that will allow you to do that more efficiently, so you're not spending that whole time straining at maximum effort, but learn to be able to control it at something less than maximum effort, but still maintain your maximum cognitive skills. So we got smarter at that. And then the kind of third step was we brought over things that we learned from special operations career fields. In the special operations career field, it was not uncommon at all to have an operator spend 10 or 12 years learning their complete skill set, to become a mid-level NCO, to be an expert at everything they did, and then have an injury that prevented them from going into the field because they didn't know how to work out right, or they did some repetitive maneuver over and over that caused damage, or when they were damaged, we didn't know how to fix it. We brought the things that we did there over into the aviation world, and fighter squadrons now have a strength trainer and a physical therapist, and in some cases a nutritionist, whose job is to be there for the members in that squadron to try to, go over their body and see if they have any weak points that they need to correct. And then once they get those corrected, to be able to maintain the strength of their system so that they can continue to perform at a high level.
Yeah, as I hear you talk, so much of organizations is learning from other parts. In this case, right, it's learning from special operations. How did they approach, longevity and injuries? Because they're certainly at a high rate for those. And what lessons and principles can you, steal, right, and implement for your own organization?
Yeah, and it's different, but it takes the same skill set to address it. I mean, the largest part of our injuries in the special operations field were from guys carrying extremely heavy loads. So carrying 120 pound pack and moving through tough terrain or jumping out of things, led to tough injuries. In the aviation world, in that fighter world, you're not carrying a 100-pound pack, but if you're 8-pound noggin, if your head weighs 8 to 10 pounds at 9 Gs, it weighs 9 times that. So now your head weighs 100 pounds. And if you get it just a little off center, left or right, those forces will really ram it down and you can injure yourself. A large percentage of people that pursue high G flying for a career have some kind of neck or back injury. And frankly, a fairly large percentage of them end up with some kind of disability when they leave the service because of that. And so what can we do to help them perform at a high level without those injuries? And also what can we do to make sure they maintain a high quality of life after they leave the service?
Yeah, and I think it's important what you emphasize, that as you do kind of seek out lessons of learning from other organizations, it's not the content, but it's the framework, right? Because obviously the pilots are at a different risk in certain areas than special operations. So you can't just carbon copy it, right? It's the framework of, you mentioned strength coach, physical therapist. It's that supportive framework that's more of the key rather than the actual content.
And then for that vast majority of airmen that we talked about, for a squadron to be deployable, they have a rating of the squadron that measures the status of their equipment and of their training or their supply and all the things that go up into a combat readiness rating. And personnel is the fourth part of that and is a big portion of it. And you need to have, a high percentage of your people ready to deploy at any given time. If you're an aircraft maintenance squadron and you're going to, deploy as part of a fighter squadron and have to have the right people to be able to keep the airplanes functioning at a high level, you need to know that people are ready to go. And so if you're a commander, you care about those elite, special athletes, but you also care about the broad majority of your force because you're being graded every day on whether you're keeping your squadron fit to deploy. And that, really good radar technician that spent 10 or 12 years learning how to make sure that your radar works in an F-15 is just as important as one of the pilots in the squadron when you deploy, so you can make sure those radars keep working. And there are injuries that happen over and over in those career fields too. There's a lot of lifting injuries. There's a lot of shoulder and back injuries. And one of the things we're trying to learn how to do there is to focus our healthcare providers on those operational deployers so that they get some continuity. Instead of seeing a different healthcare provider every time you go to the big medical clinic, we're working to try to assign a healthcare provider to that group so that they see the same people over and over and over, so they can work them through hey, let's try physical therapy for your shoulder. Let's try if there's medical things we can do for that. And then let's see if it's orthopedic work required. And then if there's not, let's see if we need to help you out of the service so we can pull you out and make room for somebody else that's deployable. That's kind of been hit or miss. And if you see a different doctor every time you go, you never make it through that projection to get something fixed. You just get that initial,
right,
let's try this first. And you never make your way through that progression.
Yeah, in medicine, they call that a lot of times the continuity of care.
Yep.
Right. And how do we have that continuity throughout the process? And it's interesting because healthcare does, face the same historical challenges where they would calibrate MRIs and CTs just like a jet. But, how do you actually calibrate and measure the readiness of your workforce?
Yep.
Interesting. So where's, with all this going on, quite a bit of advancements, where's the future you see for, health in the DoD or health in the Air Force?
Well, we've done some experimenting with, tools to be able to help people measure that. Again, our basic fitness test of a run or a walk and push-ups and sit-ups is, it basically just tells you whether people have done something enough to pass the fitness test.
Right.
You can gut your way through a 1.5 mile run. You can gut your way through some push-ups and sit-ups, even with the chronic injury. It won't identify that. And you can, we've had people have problems with heart issues and things because they're just going to gut their way through that test.
Cram
The
for the
space,
test.
yeah, the Space Force is trying to do some things with more continuous measurement with wearables. And we've tried wearables in some places across the department. Again, the special operations guys are kind of our bell cow because they'll try about anything to try to get an advantage over their adversary or over their mission. And wearables are great, but one of the things you have to think about there is how do you preserve the anonymity of the data? High performance athletes want every tool they can have to help, but they also don't want that information to be used against them. Absolutely. They don't want somebody to say, you can't do this because we got this indication out of your wearable. And so how do you keep that data anonymous so that people aren't afraid you're going to kick them out of the Air Force because of something that showed up there? Or for pilots, they're afraid it's going to create something in their medical record that'll keep them from getting an airline job, at the end of their career in the Air Force. But I think wearables and artificial intelligence to be able to go through and measure and predict where problems are and predict where opportunities are to help somebody get better and stronger is where we'll end up going for a variety of reasons. One, because computers don't get tired. They can measure it all the time. AI engines, don't get tired. They can keep predicting and they can continue to learn. And that goes along with the fact that, the biggest expense in the Department of Defense is personnel. And so anytime you can have something that you're paying somebody to look at data or to measure things, if you can do that with a wearable tool and AI, you're going to be able to do it cheaper. And so there'll be more and more pressure, both for the value you can get out of it and also for the cost savings you can get out of it.
Right. And are there ways that you found it's been helpful to balance that, anonymous approach with, basically also providing tools that are measuring things with individuals?
Yeah, there's ways to do it. And, what you end up doing is you say, okay, you're not Mike Holmes, you're number 7. And so the squadron commander knows how number 7 is doing. And if squadron commander needs to know who number 7 is, they can find out. But if that data is being collated and going all the way up to the Air Force level and bringing 100 squadrons together, they don't really need to know about number 7.
Right.
And so they can just have number 7 instead of having Mike Holmes. And so you can train algorithms, you can learn from the data without assigning somebody's name to it.
Yeah, it's having that separation between large scale AI, where it is much more anonymous with, boots on the ground. How do we make changes knowing this individual's potentially at risk? That's great. Yeah. So, I think, generally like to kind of summarize, for listeners too, of the 3 areas. And I think some of the takeaways I'm getting is, how the data really has to match expectations. We talked about the different roles in the Air Force and even the different service duration expectations. They're not all going to be 40 years and they're not all going to be pilots. I think the second takeaway is that, borrowing and using frameworks from other areas is extremely valuable. It doesn't have to be the same content, but the frameworks certainly apply. And I think then the last piece is there's certainly a lot of fear right now around AI and how that impacts things. But, you see it as such a great opportunity to be available 24/7. As you said, the AI, the computers don't get tired, and it can be approached in an anonymous way, particularly at a high level, that preserves, the ability to help boots on the ground at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's all. I think that's all right. I think the one final thing I would add is that movement health is not just important, again, to those elite athletes or to people that are working in a physical environment. The research shows that to keep people's physical, mental, and emotional health, through the stress of any life, but particularly a military life, movement is a really important part of it. And, I read a piece when I was the ACC commander that tried to dumb down all the research on kind of full spectrum health. And it broke it down into saying, there's 4 things you need to try to do every day. You need to move. You need to nourish your body to allow it to move. You need to refresh, and that your rest and your recovery, is just as important, both mentally and physically, as the exercise you do. And that then you need to connect with other people through some environment. And so if you can't move, And if you're injured or you have some condition that's keeping you from doing that, you're going to start off at a disadvantage in just maintaining both your physical health, but also your mental and emotional health as you go forward. Because if you can't move, it puts even more stress on the other three. And if you work them all together, you commit to doing some kind of moving every day. That drives usually a desire to say, how can I do this a little bit better? Let me think a little bit about what I'm eating and how I'm taking care of myself, which drives the need to get sleep and some regular time off to be able to build that up. And all those things work better if you have a partner or partners to do it with and some kind of connection. You're more likely to show up for that movement. If you have somebody to do it with that's expecting, you're more likely to eat better. If there's somebody else that's in on it with you, you're more likely to think about your recovery. When we started with wearables in our pararescue men, the wearables also measured how well you did at recovering. And there's nobody more competitive. So not only were they competing over who could get the most done in a workout for a certain amount of time, but they started to compete on who could do the best recovery, who could optimize their recovery period.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And I think that, when you start competing off things that in the past were not emphasized or traditionally harder to measure, like recovery, there can be massive gains as we work our way down to movement, being able to measure that, but also, nourishment and that rest and recovery piece.
Yep.
Fantastic. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Sure, Phil. It's great to see you. Thanks everybody out there for tuning in. And, I'll encourage you to try to join us and move, nourish, refresh, and connect.